Whoever thought that stretch velvet was going to save the day? Do you ever watch a creator put together a gorgeous garment and think, that's lovely, but I don't have the time, the equipment, the money, or the space to do that? Well, today I'm going to show that a giant sewing room or budget is absolutely not necessary to make gorgeous garments. Hello friends, and welcome or welcome back. I'm Shannon Makes, historically motivated sewist by day, circus artist by night, and today I'm going to be joined by friends and fellow YouTubers Aura, Lynn, and Angela of Demi Pint Creations as we take on the $20 sewing challenge. The parameters are fairly simple, and I'll go into more detail as we go on, but basically we've each got $20 local currency to buy everything needed to make a garment, with a few small exceptions, and the goal is to make a bespoke garment within a reasonable time frame. No fancy equipment, no expensive fabrics, just an average budget with average tools. The first thing we'll need to do is to get our supplies, but before we get to that, fans of the channel will know that I both highly enjoy gardening and working with plants, and that I live in Montreal where it's nowhere near warm enough yet to be out in the garden. That's where today's sponsor, Merge Gardens, comes in. It's a fun and casual game with a perfect combination of Merge Puzzle and Match 3 that allows you to build your own garden and fill it with all sorts of plants and wildlife, all while trying to solve the mystery behind the garden's puzzling past. The main character, Daisy, inherits her missing uncle's old garden and quickly realizes the mysterious circumstances surrounding the estate. Your task is to restore the manor, heal the cursed land, and solve the mystery. I particularly like Merge Gardens because it's engaging but low stakes, making it the perfect activity to unwind with, and I find myself playing it when I need to take a break and switch gears between more serious or intense activities. My days are quite full with physical activities, and Merge Gardens allows me to get off my feet and rest, both mentally and physically, and leaves me refreshed and ready to tackle the next activity with gusto. I don't always have the energy to organize my room in real life, but I can still get that satisfying feeling by cleaning up my garden and getting rid of all the weeds and sorting my plants into stunning flower arrangements. If this sounds like the sort of gameplay that is right up your alley, then you can either follow the link in the description to download the game or scan the QR code here. It is completely free to download and play, and supporting my sponsors helps support the channel. Okay, back to the supplies. Now, if you've been here before, you'll know that I regularly pull garbage out of the dumpster if I think I can reuse it, so this project was right up my alley. However, hunting for curbside treasure can be a very time-consuming endeavor, and I acknowledge that not everybody has the time or even the ability to wander these streets for hours every day. So instead, for this challenge, I'm going to be hitting up a local thrift store. And at the time of filming, local happened to mean Copenhagen, so we'll be taking a quick trip to my favorite thrift shop and seeing what they have to offer. So I went in here with 100 kroner, the equivalent of 20 Canadian dollars, and only the vaguest idea of a few garments I wanted to make from limited yardage. Now, not only was I looking for fabric, but also everything else I'd need for this project. Earlier, I said we had a few exceptions to the budget, and those were items that we either thought the average person might have laying around their house, or very basic sewing tools that someone just getting started with sewing could purchase and reuse for multiple projects. Anything above and beyond that had to factor into our budget. So if you wanted to use grommets, for example, that's fine, but you'll have to take it out of your $20. So right away, some of the garment options or styles I had in mind were inspired by the 1940s and their make, do, and mend attitude, caused by rationing and lack of raw materials, and which led to a need to be creative and thrifty with small amounts of fabric. Techniques like color blocking became quite popular at this time, both in sewing and in knitting, as a response to these limitations, and it was from these styles that I thought I might draw inspiration as I hunted around in the piles of fabric for something that caught my eye. Alright, now that we're back in Montreal, let's take a look at what I got. But here's the thing, making cool clothing for free is not exactly new around here. My Lord of the Rings housecoat cost me nothing but time, and my Edwardian Cuban Pete was free 99, having literally been pulled out of dumpsters all over the city. Those videos will be linked in all the usual places, so you can go have fun with them later if you'd like, but for the moment I'm thinking, what if I challenged myself to make not one, but 2 garments for $20? And if you hadn't guessed, I had a really good haul at the thrift store. So let's look at what I have, and then I'll get into how I'm thinking I might use it. First of all, I have a fair chunk of yardage of this blue and white floral print, a much smaller scrap of blue velvet, roughly a yard of blue cotton cord, and a handful of small buttons. Next up, there's this gorgeous blue paisley, a goodly quantity of blue lining fabric, the smallest scrap of burgundy bias tape, and several more buttons with no more than 6 of any kind. Lastly, I've got a bit of blue thread, a tiny piece of chalk, and some sturdy, tightly woven cotton for interlining. So here's what I'm thinking. I'm thinking that this pile will be a button-up blouse with some fun color blocking, inspired mainly by this image I found of a 1940s pattern by McCall that shows sort of various ways to make over old blouses. I think that the velvet is going to be a pain in the ass to work with, but it also matches pretty well, and it was the only thing that was like vaguely similar in color to this one, so we're gonna make it work. Then this pile here will probably become a cute little vest, either vintage or historic, I'm not quite sure yet, but I think a vest will be perfect because this is a very busy pattern, so I think a smaller garment might make it just less aggressive on the eyes, and also just there's not very much of it, so I'm thinking that this will be the front of the vest, and then the back, the inside, and the pocket linings are going to be in this complementary lining fabric. I think the vest is going to have to be its own separate video though, just for the sake of time, so if you're not subscribed, now's the time. Alright, let's talk patterns. I have several patterns that I've acquired over my years of sewing that I could use for this, but that kind of defeats the purpose because if you're just starting out sewing, that's a resource you're probably not going to have. So these are out of the question. Now, I happen to know that my favorite blouse pattern of all time is this one by Wearing History, and it comes with the 1940s jumper, and it's also the same pattern I used to make the world's coolest blouse, but unfortunately that one is way out of my budget. So I had to get crafty and go looking for free or cheap patterns. And because I'd like to keep this as relatable as possible, I decided to only consider patterns that were also size inclusive. So I've narrowed it down to 2 options. We've got the Robin blouse by the very same Aura Lynn, who is simultaneously working on their own $20 challenge, and we've got the Malia blouse by Mood Patterns. Both are relatively size inclusive and pretty affordable, but for the sake of keeping the total bill of this challenge as low as possible, I'm gonna go with the completely free Mood pattern and modify it a bit to look more vintage. But just know that if you're looking for a affordable vintage blouse pattern, the Robin blouse is only $11 and goes all the way up to a 63-inch bust. So I've got my fabric, I've got my pattern, there's just one thing left to do. I realized that not everyone has an absolutely giant cutting table at home, so I thought for this project, this size was a much more reasonable work surface. Even if it was entirely constructed out of garbage, I do realize I am super lucky to have that table. pattern pieces are all cut out, and now I'm going to start going through and making some modifications to them, starting with the sleeve, because the original Malia blouse sleeve is in fact cut in 2 pieces, and it's giving me some serious flashbacks to my magazine collab with Aura from a few months ago. Excuse me?
What is that?
What are those sleeves?
What the? I hate it so much.
I hate it too. Fortunately, Mood has some instructions on their website for how to combine these 2 pattern pieces into one to get a much more normal, streamlined looking sleeve. So that is the first thing I'm gonna do. With the sleeve complete, I moved on to the rest of the pattern, starting with the front, where I eliminated the side dart and modified the facing to extend all the way to the shoulder seam. Then I traced out the top part of the blouse to make a separate pattern piece for a front yoke. Next, I made a back yoke pattern as well, trying to make it approximately the same size as the front one. Lastly, I decided to add some pockets to the front of the blouse, so I had to draft those as well as a pocket flap for the cover, and because I didn't have any of my fancier rulers, I just used the factory square edges of a sheet of paper to fold a pocket that was the right shape and had perfectly square corners. Okay, we've got some new pieces, we've got some modified pieces. Let's take a look. Alright, so we've got the blouse front as well as the front yoke. We've got the back and the back yoke. We've got the 2 collar pieces, the pocket and the pocket flap, and the sleeve and the sleeve cuff. The sleeve is definitely the most changed, being both wider in here as well as taller on the sleeve cap, which I'm hoping should give it a bit more poof and a definitely more vintage look. So right now the plan is to use the blue and white print as the main body of the blouse, and then to go in and add some nice velvet accents on the front and back yoke, the sleeve cuffs, and the pocket flaps. Now, originally the plan was to make a slightly fancier shaped yoke. However, velvet is notoriously difficult to work with and also kind of hard to get nice sharp corners in. So I decided to keep it fairly simple on this one. And at the moment, everything is currently washed. It just needs to be ironed, and then we can go start cutting things out. So one thing I noticed when ironing this fabric all out that I had not seen before is that there are a few defaults in it, most significantly this one here, which is rather large and very noticeable. The other 2 are significantly less noticeable, and so if I need to include them in, say, the back of the blouse, I'm not as worried about that. But this one I do need to be careful about, do need to work around it, make sure I'm not including it in any of the main pieces, and I think it's gonna be okay because I do have a fair amount of fabric in here, but it's something I need to be aware of. I need to cut my fabric carefully. Worst case, I could make it a short sleeve blouse instead of a long sleeve blouse if I run out of fabric. We've got options, so just need to be keeping that in mind as I cut all this fabric out. Alright, so it is now day 2. Day 1 went pretty much as expected. I have all of my pieces cut out. I did hit a small hiccup when I realized that I wasn't going to have enough fabric left to cut out the full-size sleeve, so I went in and had to modify that pattern and make it a 3/4 length sleeve, which honestly, it's fine. I love 3/4 length sleeves, so not a problem there. I just took a couple quick measurements and hacked off the bottom of that pattern piece, but then as it turns out, even that wasn't quite enough just because of the way that my fabric remnants were shaped. So I had to go in and turn the 1-piece sleeve into a 2-piece sleeve, which yes, does add more pieces, more seams to sew, more work in general, but it did allow me to make much better use of the fabric left over that I had. And let me tell you, I used pretty much every last inch of the blue and white cotton print. This is all that I have left over, and in fact, actually the 2 little pockets, I had to go in and piece them together because that is how tight I am on fabric. The good news is that because it's such a busy print, you can hardly see that it's pieced together, and there's going to be the little pocket flap covering it, so I'm not really worried about that. Then last night I went in and read the mood instructions to see how they want you to assemble the blouse, and then I went through, made a little list, and then added some of my own additional steps because of course I've complicated this pattern a little bit, so that does mean I have to add some additional steps in there. And I think that means that we are ready to start sewing, and according to my list, the first thing that we're going to be doing is completing the front button placket. If you've never done a blouse with a back yoke, it can be a little counterintuitive, but there's a way to do it where you can hide all the raw edges, which is exactly what I was going for because this velvet leaves a fine blue dust everywhere, so I wanted as few exposed edges as possible. Also, the nap of the velvet makes it want to constantly shift around, so every seam that involved a velvet layer either had a lot of basting or a ton of pins to hold the fabric in place while I sewed it down permanently. The back yokes were attached, then the front and the back were joined at the shoulder seams, and then the inside yoke stitched down by hand, hiding the raw edges. Not only did the velvet shift and fray, but it was also really bulky, so whenever possible, I trimmed the seam allowances down as small as I could. Because I was short on fabric, some of my collar panels were cut in 2 pieces, which I had to join together before I could start assembly. It was right about now that I started second-guessing myself. Not the shirt itself, because that was turning out heckin' cute, but about the project as a whole. I started doubting that this project would actually be inspiring to anyone. Making a blouse for under $20? That seems like a fairly easy cop-out. Should I have done a bigger project? A more historically inspired garment? An entire outfit? Something bigger and grander? I don't know, I still feel like I could have done better, been more inspiring in my choice of projects, but the honest truth was that the thrift store I visited didn't have enough yardage of anything that interested me enough to make a full outfit, and I didn't have the time to try and visit a second one. But honestly, that is legitimately an obstacle that many of us face. Lack of access to good, cheap fabric. So I guess what I originally interpreted as a default in my project is in fact a reality that many of us face. So maybe I should just embrace it and cut myself a bit of a break sometimes. So I just finished sewing the collar onto the bodice of the blouse and it went really, really well, way better than I anticipated. There is just one little section here where the fabric kind of got caught and is doing a little bit of bunching. So I'm just gonna go in with my seam ripper and unpick a little section here, repin it, restitch it, and then the collar will be just about done. And all that leaves us is the buttons, buttonholes, and the sleeves. Honestly, this velvet is way easier to work with than I anticipated. I don't know if it's because I'm using a ton of pins or what, but I am quite pleased with how this is turning out so far. So let's just pick this little section, restitch it, and then we can move on. In the absence of a serger, I decided to do the rest of the blouse with French seams to hide the raw edges and to give a nice clean finish on the inside. This definitely added some time to the project because it essentially doubled my pinning, ironing, and sewing time, but I was still only on day 2 and I thought it would make the final blouse much more enjoyable, so I decided it was worth it. So the main portion of the sleeves are sewn together, but I think we might have a little bit of a sticking point, and that is that when I shortened the sleeve to be a 3/4 length sleeve, the cuff went from having to go around my wrist to having to go around my forearm, which is obviously slightly larger, and I did not account for that in the patterning process. But I think we're actually going to be okay, because as you saw when I originally cut the cuffs out, I did have them basted to this piece of cotton just for some stability and to help them behave. But under that, as you know, the velvet itself is actually a stretch velvet. So if the cuff with the cotton does not fit around my forearm, then we're going to try and take the cotton off and see if that will help it fit. And actually it might be really perfect because it might help it kind of stay snugly where I want it to sit. So that's the next thing to do. Try that out, see how it works, and then continue assembling the sleeves. Whoever thought that stretch velvet was going to save the day? All right, so here's test number 1, which still has the cotton on it. Okay, so I know it looks like it's going, but it's actually, you can see that the cotton pieces are not actually touching and it's starting to tear open here. So that's not looking promising. We're gonna try the one without the cotton on it. Oh, easy, easy. And it even has a little bit of extra give, which is fantastic. All right, I think we've solved that question. We're gonna be going without the cotton lining. So the sleeve was gathered down and the velvet cuff was pinned on, again with a generous helping of pins, and then sewn on by machine with only one small hiccup, which was quickly remedied. The sleeves were also sewn to the bodice with French seams, which unfortunately kind of took away a bit of the poof that I had drafted in, but it left me with a super clean finish on the inside, so it was an acceptable trade. And that about wrapped up day 2. All that was left on day 3 were some finishing touches, attaching the pockets with their contrast flaps, sewing the hem of the blouse, and closing the inside of the cuffs. The last 2 were done by hand because I enjoy the process and because I felt like it gave me better control, but they could just as easily be done by machine if desired. Okay, some quick thoughts before the final reveal. First of all, the velvet was surprisingly easy to work with, and I really enjoy the contrast of the solid against the really busy floral print. The modifications to the pattern were for the most part successful, and I think the blouse looks relatively vintage, or at least vintage inspired. I made absolutely killer use of my fabric. There's basically no usable scraps left over, so that's always a win. And actually, I'd love to know what was your most challenging or unique thrift store project. Have you faced a similar lack of materials, and how did you have to get creative to overcome it? Let me know down in the comments, and while you're there, be sure to go check out and read everyone else's stories too, because I always get some really interesting anecdotes. I don't think I'll do a behind the scenes for this project because there are so many other videos to watch for this challenge. I'll have part 2 where I make my vest, plus Angela and Aura will have their own videos out shortly, and the 3 of us will be coming together for a sort of communal behind the scenes video where we talk about what inspired this challenge, go more in depth on our thoughts about making sewing accessible, and talk about our own unique challenges with this prompt. A playlist with all those videos will be linked in the description when they're all released, and if you found this video valuable or entertaining, give it a little thumbs up. It really helps others find the video, and I greatly appreciate it. Okay, without further ado, here's the final reveal. In the end, am I revolutionizing the world of historical costuming or vintage fashion with this upcycle? No, but I do think it's a reflection of a real-world situation that many of us find ourselves in, so hopefully that in itself can be inspiring, plus a whole new garment for under $6 is really not bad. The marks of my constraints can be seen in the garment itself, such as the faded portion I had to include on the back of the blouse, or the bleached out section I had to use in my pocket flap, but that just makes me like the garment more, not less. If you want to support the work I'm doing here, I have a Patreon account where you can become a member and get access to extended videos, monthly vlogs, and more. And be sure to subscribe so you can follow along for part 2 of this challenge to see if I can complete my vest without busting my budget. Thank you for watching, and I'll catch you in part 2. When I hold it up like this, it looks like it's enough for a vest, but we all know that's not how sewing works.